Hello, my fellow Homo sapiens. I trust that you're doing amazing on this day. Before I get into today's discussion regarding the layers of false light, I wanted to mention essentially that I'm aware that especially my last two audios, they were infused with such emotion, especially my last one where I discussed the events of what's happening in our world right now and how I was reframing them. I recognize that emotion plays a large part of how we act and what we do and essentially how we're controlled. So this, in a sense, plays an important part of what I'm wanting to discuss today. So I hope that through discernment you heard my true intentions of what I was trying to portray, and that I truly do believe there is more unification that we can do as a species. And so today I would love to speak about false light and the layers of false light. As I was creating the description for this particular broadcast, I came across an analogy. And how I see it is false light was a tactic, you could say, to distract us or perhaps entrain and bind us to a narrative that we were supposed to believe. And if we chose to step out of that belief and we were more perhaps susceptible or connected to source, to God, to the light, that there was another layer just below that, and that we would therefore believe that we had gotten out and therefore, connected with that. And yet that layer too was controlled. And for those souls who realized that even the alternative story had its holes, that there was another layer behind that. And it was almost as if we were living in a spider web, and our beginning of our venture started essentially right from the beginning, the middle of the spider's web. And that when we began our journey, we began already encased and essentially wrapped like a spider, like a fly in a spider's web. And our first step was to simply get out of that web. To get out of I forgot what they call it, but maybe in the future I'll use a better word. But when the fly has been cocooned in the spider's web or the spider's bindings, whatever. Anyways, so that analogy struck pretty well with what I wanted to talk about today. And so, when we talk about false light, or at least when I talk about false light, my understanding is false light was essentially false. It was light pretending to be divine. And many people, I would say, that are of these different varying lower levels of religious control, I'm trying to find a right word to describe it, but these varying levels of control, well, they recognize that the higher levels of religious control were actually, sometimes they even realized they were demonic. And so how I view it is that at one point in time, we were controlled by a power of, per se, technology. But as humanity, as Homo sapiens, more importantly, began to wake up, they realized that they had to create differing levels, per se, or a different level in order to maintain that authority over the Homo sapiens. And so, many, many eons ago, we had a technological society that perhaps better understood reality. Eventually, we turned into something called the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire essentially controlled by domination, it controlled by war and all that lovely stuff. And that at that time, our world empire, it had what they called, or at least I was told was called, a Caesar. And Caesar essentially, or was Caesar's the right name? But anyways, an emperor. There was an emperor of the empire. And when that control mechanism or that style of control began to break down, well, then they brought in other things, and they basically took the Roman Empire and took that position as emperor of the empire and turned it into the Pope, and turned the Roman Empire into the Catholic Church. Now, that's my belief system. However, even many of the people who are waking up and have went to other forms of religion that are one step removed from that recognize that. They recognize the corruption that was the Roman Catholic Church. Even in most recent cases, people recognize the pedophilia that has and perhaps continues to be within the Roman Catholic Church, because the way that we envision sex and sexuality, even in our societies today, is quite limited compared to how others view it. But we won't get into that. We'll leave that amazing conversation of sexuality till later, and I don't necessarily use amazing the way that it would be used right now, more as surprising. So with the layers of false light, we had our understanding, and the world itself was ensnared or basically wrapped like the fly within a spider's web and taken to the middle of the web. And a lot of the world at one point in time, you can kind of view, was pulled to the center of the web. Now, in my viewpoint, at least, the center of the web wasn't just the Roman Catholic Church. It was perhaps more so, or more akin to, the three different religions that essentially dominate the religious aspect of our world. And that was, in my understanding, my understanding is, Catholicism and Judaism and Islamism. I don't know if I used the words correctly, but nonetheless, you understand what I mean. And so the world itself was divided up between these three religions. See, at one point in time, we used to have a world where there were many gods, and each different aspect of life had a god. And after some point in time, this was, as I said, decided that we would go a different way, and we means the cattle of earth, would be herded into three separate camps. I guess some point in time they discovered that if they divide the world into three separate religions, even though there's an entire planet of us, that they would have an easier time to pit us against each other than when it came to war. And essentially, that's what they were looking to do. However, as I mentioned before, going through the different layers of the web, as time went by, we began to be more influenced by the lighter source, by God, by our connection, which we had always maintained, and darkness was unable to cut it off. So they needed to give us something to worship. And even if you look into the Bible and nowadays, you'll see that there are various versions of the Bible, and they're all man-written, like meaning that all of the Bibles of today are written by man. Yes, the original Bible that perhaps we have yet to see, perhaps remnants of it will be revealed underneath the Sphinx. However, the actual versions of the Bible, from the King James version to the New Testament to all the other versions that are edited specifically and set up for all these different breakdowns of those religions, like the different sects of those religions. Nonetheless, the Bible itself is a perfect fact that are stories that perhaps originally came from source, from God, so many generations ago. And I'm talking about tens of thousands of years. I'm not talking about the timeline that they try to impose on us and get us to believe by changing from a Julian calendar to a Roman calendar. And as I mentioned, they even added more months and such. And so I'm meaning that, actually, my point is just to simply say that the Bible is a rewritten book, rewritten by men. And so, with that being said, that shows evidence of tampering with God's word. And you can easily see by just the multiple translations and meanings that it was tampered with. Nonetheless, that's not the focus of this. The focus of this is to see that, yes, there were three main religions, and then each one of those religions was then further segregated. There could also be a case made for that there was a fourth religion, definitely at one time quite a lot more powerful than perhaps it is now, Buddhism, or religions that are based around Buddhism. China and Japan at one point in time and India had a very large Buddhist population, which has been converted into Christianity and Catholicism and Islam right now. So while there may have been 4 originally, now there's a dominant 3. And these 3 or 4, however we want to look at it, were then separated into further sects, or further levels, meaning that if people started to feel that these main 3 or 4 religions held holes and they wanted answers, then there was another layer below that. And this layer essentially allowed for the continuing control over these people, because once again, it led into separation. And that's how I see religion to be on our world, that any religion that stands to say my God is better than your God, all of them therefore stand on a foundation of deception, because I feel that God is love, God is truth. And many of these religions definitely don't stand on truth and are definitely controlled by money. Moving on from there, so we live in a world where all of our religions have been watered down all the way to the point where there's so many different versions of the church now. And all we have to do is, remember from, say, at least 10 years ago, before this one world religion tried to move itself in, that there was baptism and Presbyterian and Orthodox this and Roman Catholic and all these different versions of Christianity. And then there was so many different versions of everything else. I'm not exactly informed in all the different versions of Islam or Buddhism or even Judaism. However, and actually, I definitely encourage you, if you are knowledgeable about this, to write all the different ones in the comments that you're aware of. And let's essentially make a game of this to disclose how many different versions of a religion were there. The fact remains is that these religions, this false light, was meant to ensnare us and keep us ensnared, that no matter how much we moved or felt that the edge of the web was close, that each time we would make it to one further rung, that there would be another level of entrenchment. For instance, there was an order called, or a group of people called the Essenes, and the Essenes were believers of Christianity, at least what they believed Christianity to be, and that it is said that Jesus was part of that. He was part of that group of people, and that they say that Jesus, that might not even have been his name, they said that he had actually come to earth or incarnated here so that he could teach us and he could show us perhaps that we were all of God. And essentially, I say perhaps because I'm jumping ahead to what I wanted to say, and that is and was that even when we reached that end or that space where we realized there was something other than religion, and religion meaning a church with a person that stands up at the front of the church and tells you what you should believe and assigns guilt and shame in the stories that it tries to perpetuate in order to hold us in control, and then at the end asks, and in some cases demands. Did you know that throughout history the church has demanded people pay money, and in fear of, if they did not, that they would somehow be cursed or perhaps even expelled at the consequence of death from those organizations. Like, there's a lot of places in the world that have used religion in order to stifle so many different, perhaps, awakenings of us. And that gets into another layer of the actual false light, was the introduction of essentially hijacking even spirituality and even the new age movement. And the new age movement was, in my opinion anyways, another level of the false light. For those people who got quite far, and they were referred to as outliers or outcriers, or essentially people who would not submit to any form of religious control, they ended up joining a group called New Age. And New Age were people that were looking for truth. They were looking for answers. And so the false light, through the different variations of demonic beings that controlled our planet, created another level. They created the lower astral. They created a lot of different terms where people could still essentially be controlled and manipulated, believing that they were doing the work of God, when in fact there were beings that worked on those lower levels to maintain their control. See, growing up, I always heard of this person called Archangel Michael. And Archangel Michael, from what I understood at the time, was a benevolent being who worked for God and was helping mankind through this spirituality. And although I didn't do much into or fall much into the actual New Age movement, Archangel Michael, Archangel Gabriel, and others appeared to be helpers of the spiritual movement. And before we even broke away from the New Age movement, which had a lot of concepts that, they sounded good on the top, but once you got into exploring them, they seemed to have a lot of holes in them, which is understandable because, they're layers of that last layer of the web. They're the ones that are more susceptible to the wind, and because they're further out to where the spider is essentially holding the majority of the people. And so we had these archangels, and we had these other things that people started to channel, and they started to trust them because they were unknown. And even during a lot of times there in our history, there would be beings such as witches and warlocks, basically people like witches, for example, people who essentially not worshipped but revered nature. And so even that level was hijacked. And after a while, when the church wanted to cause destruction and mayhem, they would go on witch hunts, or they would go on crusades, and they would essentially cause their soldiers to damn themselves by harming others for no reason other than they were told to by a supposed king or a pope or some other knight or whatever it was. Anyways, so we have New Age, or we had New Age, and then we moved into differing layers of spirituality. And these spirituality included ideas like you can manifest anything you want. And if you're not manifesting the life that you want, well, then it's all your fault, and you need to go do better. See, one of the things that I discovered even about the book The Secret is that, well, there was truth to what was being said, the amount of lies, or perhaps not lies, nonetheless, we'll call it omissions, was great. See, because one of the things that has been concealed from us all along was that there in fact existed differing levels of evil that essentially consumed all of those layers of false light. I'll definitely recommend that you go back and listen to my audio where I talk about false light and false darkness, but we're just going to keep this to false light. And so within the realm of false light, we get into this idea that we create our reality, that we are fully responsible for our reality. And this is, in my opinion anyways, a final layer, or one of the final layers, I hope, or the final layer, actually, I hope. Not hope. The final layer I trust before we get to freeing ourselves from the web. And this particular layer that bind us gave us the idea, or the guilt trip, of it being essentially our fault. It was not acknowledging that there are entities and forces, whether we call them archons, or we call them the deep state, or we call them narcissistic energies, whatever you'd like to call them. But there was this layer of energy that essentially ran through the entire web, that not only perpetuated this, it posed itself as beings of light. And these beings of light essentially were permitted to give us a certain amount of truth, but not enough to actually get ourselves released. And therefore it kept us binded, and it has done this for an extremely long time. There are some people that channel different beings online that do tell a lot of truth. And because that truth resonates, the way that we're programmed is to accept the whole package. And I mean the general public is programmed to resonate with the truth they hear, and then to accept the other things that are said too. And so with that being said, there are many people in the New Age and then into the final layer of the spiritual community that believed that a lot of things they were being led to believe. For instance, I joined a group of people called Action for Canada during the 2020 event, and I was blown away with the understanding that although these people understood some of the fundamental problems of our 3D world, problems within our government, problems within the way that business was organized, problems within the daily lives we lived, there wasn't an understanding of anything beyond that, because religiously they were still ingrained or entrapped within their perception of what their religious guidance was. And religion played such a strong role in that organization that I eventually left. And soon after that, many others also left. Now, why all of this is important is because, as I've mentioned often before, that awareness plays a huge role in our awakening, in our ascension. And ascension simply means our evolution, in my opinion. We can go into more detail at a later date. I hope we do. Yet, that's kind of how I see it. See, I personally believe that we are all of God. I also believe that the being that we refer to Jesus as, he came here over 2,000 years ago to express that, on a mission to plant the seed that we in fact were all of God. And what of God means does not mean like God. So that's a very important distinguishment, because to be like God means that we are God, but we're, in my opinion, not God. We are of God means that we have some or many of the powers that God does have, but we have been essentially limited in our control of those powers as part of this web that we have slowly through several lifetimes, more than several actually. I once heard, I believe it was Ram Dass, talk about his understanding that we are, like, the number of lifetimes we have had are like taking one grain of sand and dropping it on a mountain, and all of those grains of sand that make up that mountain are they resemble the number of lifetimes that we've had. So imagine for yourself a height of some big Mount Kilimanjaro, and that if you took every grain of sand from there. Now, he says it a lot more poetically. I'm just kind of sharing the idea, but imagine something like Kilimanjaro, and every single grain of sand that makes up the mountain is an example or reference to one lifetime. So that we've had a lot of lifetimes to make it through this spider web. And yet we still sit here right now with a lot of people that are still in those differing layers of awakening, of ensnaring within the spider's web. And that the false light did a really good job of keeping us binded so that they could take as much from us as possible. And people ask, well, is there a God? Of course there is. Some people call it source, some people call it God, some people call it the creator. Some people, even like me in my younger years, melted it down to the word universe. See, when I used the word universe, I was simply using a word that was away from what religion had created for me. They had given me the word God, and I wanted a different word, so I chose universe. But in a sense, universe depersonalized it. And the whole reason for all these layers of false light is because God has always been within us. He's always been, she has been, however you want to view it. God has always been, source has always been connected to us, our entire existence. And yet false light was put there so that we would have a distraction or a reason that they could simply justify for what they were doing and how we were feeling. See, I believe that our intuition and the feeling that we feel inside is God talking directly to us. And false light gave us all of these constructs to have people that were supposedly and paid a lot of money to build lots of big buildings, but they simply put their agents, which we call priests and popes and fathers and cardinals and prophets and all these other words, that they put these people in between us and source, between us and God. And they did this so that they could always justify whatever it is they were doing in order to maintain us within that web. And well, this great awakening is awakening beyond all of their different types of control that they've had, waking up beyond the false light. And essentially, this is the time that we are to awake. See, we saw a movie called 2012 in 2012 that foretold the end of the world. And even the mainstream propaganda to do with the Mayan calendar and it being the end of the world seemed more like an attempt to project us to perhaps create that. Throughout time, we have went through a lot of different catastrophic events that wiped out the planet and wiped out the populations that were on the planet. And regardless of who was in charge of that or the result of that, because, you know, I'm speaking in this moment of now, we have had the experience of all of those atrocities and, as I said, cataclysms. And even now, there's a large amount of the false light that's perpetuating the idea of a giant Armageddon or a giant catastrophic ending to our world, which only leads into further fear. Yet this is the way that false light had done it in the past. They would project on us and they would tell us about comets that were coming in to destroy the planet, or great earthquakes or great floods or great fires or whatever it is they wanted to, alien invasions or newly destructive empires that were slowly going to take over the world. Nonetheless, they would bring on all these fearful ideas, and that would essentially set us into a state of trauma. And then a reset would come in, and then they would just do it all over again. However, the difference with this particular time, as I've come to understand it, is that, first of all, there's no more time for them to do that. It's over. Their game is over. False light is over. False light is being exposed at a massive rate around the world. Gurus all over are falling to truth. They are no longer able to sustain their lies filled with bits of truth. So, where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us on a journey of healing. That leaves us on a journey of self-discovery and truly seeking who we are as Homo sapiens, who we are as beings, who we are as of God, and our true ability. As I said before, that does not mean we are like God. It does not mean that we are essentially disregarding anything. Yes, there are certain groups out there, atheists and other satanic worshipers, who would have us believe otherwise. However, and a lot of scientists also have broken away. However, things such as quantum physics truly demonstrates that there is a God and there is science, and that both of them are at many times synonymous with each other, means that they hold truth that align with each other. So with all that being said, I feel we are almost out. And how this movie that we're watching ends, how false light is finally distinguished, or not distinguished, extinguished, yeah. How false light is finally extinguished, well, that essentially depends on each and every one of us. However, God has returned. God has waited to a time where we are no longer binded by covenants and agreements and contracts which allow darkness to essentially use light, false light, and false darkness to hold us within that spider's web. That we are now, and through the grace of God, through the grace of Source, being given, or restored more importantly, our divine connection as co-creators. And that's a really important word, co-creators. We co-create our world, and that's where I was talking before about The Secret and other books like that, trying to explain to us, or perhaps further program us into believing that we were, in a sense, at complete fault if our manifestations didn't manifest right in front of us. See, what I've come to understand is, or perhaps what our manifestation skills are, is that we allow God to create through us, that we allow Source to experience through us, that when we feel love, true love, I don't mean jealous love, true love, like when we have that connection, and you know it, I know it. Oftentimes I walk past someone and something about them, mostly when they're women, but even sometimes when they're men, there's a connection I feel, and often I'm reminded of what love feels like, what real love feels like. And that is the connection, in my opinion, or my belief, that God is essentially feeling or experiencing through me. And you see, as I said before, they didn't want us to know that. They wanted us to mix up our feelings of love with lust. And that's why we'll call it the beautification of women, or the sensationalization of sexuality, has been pretty dominant, even though they try to say that, it's not, or they try to hide it. There's a whole underworld of sexuality, which perhaps, like I said, we'll talk about in the future. Nonetheless, I feel, as I had said, that we are at that end, that 2012 represented a time perhaps, or around a time, that we could have perhaps ascended. However, we were far behind schedule, and it's taken all of these extra years and all of these events to wake us up as a collective, as a energetic group of beings that were perhaps dispersed through individual constructs and individual realities that we all inhabited in order to have an experience and work together to perhaps wake up or ripple our love to our local communities and our local populations. So I'm going to leave it there. I trust that what I've meant to say is in that long monologue somewhere, and I'm going to go drink some water now so that I can essentially refresh my throat. I thank you so much for sharing your attention with me and with God, because I believe that God speaks through all of us, and perhaps often many of us are unable to hear due to the large amount of distortions, whether it's all the cell towers or all the 5G frequencies or all of their technology, which distorts our ability to hear our inner voice. And that's where source is. That's where I believe that the connection is the connection's inward. The connection's through perhaps our chakras and through our love and through our compassion and through our ability to be joyful, to truly be joyful. And of course, to be gay, because remember, gay means to be super happy. And other words, yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for sharing your time with me. And I look forward to seeing everyone on the other side of our ascension, and join me as we step into new earth, or however else you want to call it, paradise, heaven, heaven on earth, whatever it is, however you view it, however we get there together. When we get there, there's going to be a rather large celebration, and I look forward to being a part of it with each and every one of you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.